She couldn't breathe. Not from the cancer ravaging her body, not from the chemotherapy burning through her veins, but from the way her nurse looked at her. Like she still mattered, like she was still a woman, still alive. For weeks, she built a future in her mind, a second chance. Love when she thought love was gone forever. Until the day she confessed her feelings and he said 4 words that shattered everything. I have a partner. Not a girlfriend, not a wife, a partner, a man. She had been so desperately lonely, so pathetically invisible, that she'd mistaken basic human kindness for romance. And now she wanted to die, not from illness, but from shame. The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and something else Margaret couldn't quite name. Perhaps despair. Perhaps simply the staleness of recycled air that had passed through too many struggling lungs. She lay in the adjustable bed, staring at the pale gray walls of Phoenix General Hospital's oncology wing, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the vertical blinds. Outside, the Arizona heat shimmered off the pavement, distorting the view of the parking lot where her daughter's silver Honda had disappeared 3 hours ago. 58 years old, and Margaret Chen felt ancient. The chemotherapy had stolen her thick black hair, leaving behind a wispy gray fuzz that made her look, she thought bitterly, like a dandelion ready to blow away in the wind. Her reflection in the darkened television screen showed a gaunt face with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too large, too frightened. The breast cancer diagnosis had come 14 months ago, on an ordinary Tuesday, turning her carefully constructed life into a series of medical appointments, insurance battles, and increasingly rare visits from family members who had their own lives to live. Her ex-husband Robert had remarried 5 years ago to a woman 15 years younger, a detail that still stung more than Margaret cared to admit. Her daughter Jennifer, 32 and perpetually busy with her marketing career and new twin babies, visited twice a week with forced cheerfulness that made Margaret feel more alone than actual solitude. Her son David lived in Seattle and called every Sunday with the mechanical regularity of someone checking off a duty. Even her sister Patricia in Tucson had stopped coming after Margaret had snapped at her during a particularly bad day of nausea and pain. The door opened with a soft hydraulic sigh, and Margaret instinctively closed her eyes, feigning sleep. She had learned this trick to avoid the endless parade of medical students, social workers, and well-meaning volunteers who seemed to think she needed conversation when all she wanted was to disappear. "Mrs. Chen, I know you're awake. Your breathing changes when you pretend to sleep." The voice was male, warm, with a hint of gentle amusement. Margaret opened her eyes and found herself looking at a man in navy blue scrubs who was adjusting her IV bag with practiced efficiency. He was perhaps 35, with sandy brown hair, green eyes that crinkled at the corners, and an easy smile that seemed genuine rather than professionally manufactured. "I'm Daniel Morrison. I'll be your primary nurse for the evening shift. I see here you've had a rough day with the treatment." Margaret wanted to respond with her usual cold dismissal, but something in his tone stopped her. He didn't sound pitying. He didn't sound falsely cheerful. He simply sounded present, as if she were a real person rather than a bed number. "Every day is rough," she said, her voice raspier than she intended. "Fair enough." Daniel pulled up the visitor's chair and sat down, which surprised her. Nurses didn't usually sit. They bustled. They checked. They moved on. "Tell me about the pain." "Scale of 1 to 10 isn't helpful. Describe it. Sharp, dull, burning." For the next 20 minutes, Margaret found herself actually talking, really talking, about the bone-deep ache that kept her awake at night, the nausea that made even water taste metallic, the fear that lived in her chest like a second cancer. Daniel listened without interrupting, without glancing at his watch, without offering empty platitudes about staying positive. When he finally stood to check on other patients, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Seen. Actually seen. "I'll be back in an hour to change your dressing," Daniel said at the door. "And Margaret, we're going to get you through this." After he left, Margaret lay very still, replaying the sound of her name in his voice. Not Mrs. Chen. Not honey or sweetie like some of the other nurses said with cloying familiarity. Margaret, her name, spoken with respect, and something that felt almost like friendship. She told herself it meant nothing. He was just doing his job. But when he returned an hour later, precisely as promised, and again sat down to talk while he worked, Margaret felt the first crack in the protective ice she had built around herself. Over the next week, as Margaret's hospital stay extended due to complications from the treatment, Daniel became the bright spot in her gray existence. He worked 3 12-hour shifts each week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and Margaret found herself watching the clock on the other days, counting the hours until he would return. He brought her sugar-free Jell-O in lime flavor after she mentioned it was the only thing that didn't make her nauseous. He adjusted her pillows without being asked, seeming to know instinctively when her back was aching. He told her stories about his rescue dog, a 3-legged terrier named Captain, and showed her photos on his phone that made her laugh for the first time in months. "You have a beautiful smile," Daniel said one evening, as he was documenting her vitals. "You should use it more often." Margaret felt heat rise to her pale cheeks. "Not much to smile about these days." "I disagree. You're responding well to the treatment. Dr. Patel said your latest scans show the tumor is shrinking. That's worth smiling about." "Is it?" Margaret heard the bitterness in her own voice. "So I survive? For what? To go back to my empty house and watch television until I die of something else?" Daniel set down his tablet and looked at her directly. "Margaret, you're 58, not 98. You have decades ahead of you. What would you do with them if you could do anything?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her about the future in so long. Everyone spoke in careful terms about treatments and statistics, never about dreams or possibilities. "I used to paint," she said quietly. "Before Robert, before the kids, before everything. I wanted to be an artist. Watercolors mostly. Landscapes. Why did you stop?" "Life happened. Marriage, mortgage, practicality." She shrugged, the movement making her IV line pull slightly. "You can't raise a family on art." "But your family's raised now. Your kids are grown. What's stopping you?" Margaret looked at him. This kind stranger who seemed to believe she still had value, still had time. Fear, I suppose. Fear that I'm too old, too sick, too late. Daniel reached over and gently squeezed her hand, a gesture that felt both professional and profoundly personal. "You're not too anything. You're exactly where you need to be to start again." That night, after he had gone home, Margaret lay awake thinking about his hand on hers, the warmth of his touch, the conviction in his voice. She tried to remember the last time Robert had looked at her the way Daniel did, with attention, with interest, with genuine care. She couldn't. Somewhere in the quiet darkness of that hospital room, with machines beeping softly and the distant sound of nurses' voices at the station, Margaret Chen felt something dangerous and wonderful unfurling in her chest. It wasn't hope about beating cancer. It was something far more treacherous, the first fragile whisper of possibility, that maybe, just maybe, someone could see her as a woman again, not just a patient or an ex-wife or an obligation. She didn't yet recognize it as the beginning of something that would nearly destroy her. She only knew that for the first time in 14 months, she fell asleep thinking about tomorrow instead of dreading it. Chapter 2. The Dangerous Bloom. Margaret was discharged from Phoenix General on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the desert heat had finally broken into something almost pleasant. Jennifer picked her up in the Honda, twins crying in their car seats, and drove her to the small ranch-style house in Ahwatukee that Margaret had kept after the divorce. The place felt cavernous and foreign after 2 weeks in the hospital, full of furniture that belonged to a life she no longer recognized. "I've stocked your fridge," Jennifer said, hauling in bags while jiggling a fussy baby on her hip. "And I've arranged for home health visits. A nurse will come 3 times a week to check your port and help with medications." "What nurse?" Margaret asked too quickly, hating the hope in her voice. Jennifer consulted her phone with one hand. "Let me see. Morrison. Daniel Morrison. He does home health on his days off from the hospital. You're lucky. He's supposed to be excellent." Margaret's heart did something complicated in her chest. She told herself it was just the relief of familiar care. Nothing more. But that night, as she sat alone in her living room, with the television playing to empty space, she caught herself, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror, touching the wispy fuzz on her scalp, wondering what Daniel would think seeing her here, in her real life, without the neutral territory of the hospital. He arrived Thursday morning at 10 o'clock sharp, carrying a professional medical bag and wearing khaki pants with a light blue polo shirt that made his green eyes even more striking. Captain, the 3-legged terrier, trotted beside him on a leash. "Hope you don't mind," Daniel said, gesturing to the dog. "I'm between appointments and didn't want to leave him in the car. He's very well behaved." "I don't mind at all." Margaret found herself smiling genuinely as the little dog sniffed around her living room before settling on the rug with a contented sigh. "Come in, please." The home visits developed a comfortable rhythm. Daniel would check her vitals, clean and dress her portside, review her medications, and then, this was the part Margaret lived for, he would sit with her for 20 or 30 minutes, talking. Not about cancer or treatment, but about life. He told her about growing up in Flagstaff, about his mother who taught 3rd grade, about his love of hiking and his hope to one day hike the full Arizona Trail. She told him about her children, about her failed marriage, about the painting she had abandoned. "You should start again," Daniel said during his 2nd visit, sitting on her couch with Captain curled beside him. "Art is therapeutic. There's actual research about it. I don't even have supplies anymore. I gave everything away years ago." The next week, Daniel arrived with a surprise: a beginner's watercolor set, brushes, and quality paper. "Consider it a prescription," he said, his eyes warm with that familiar kindness. "Doctor's orders. Well, nurse's orders." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears, which felt foreign and wonderful. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to. Everyone needs something to look forward to." That afternoon, let this be yours. Margaret set up the supplies on her dining room table and tried to paint. Her hands shook. Her technique was rusty. But she mixed colors and made marks on paper for the first time in 30 years. It felt like coming home. Over the following weeks, as November arrived and the Phoenix weather turned crisp and perfect, Margaret's feelings for Daniel evolved from gratitude into something far more consuming. She found herself planning for his visits days in advance, choosing her clothes carefully. Not the shapeless comfort wear she lived in, but actual outfits with matching colors. She bought a silk scarf to cover her stubbly head, applying it in different ways until she found an arrangement that felt almost elegant. She started wearing makeup again, just a touch of blush and lipstick, telling herself it was about feeling human, not about impressing anyone. But she was lying to herself, and somewhere deep down, she knew it. She began to interpret every gesture as potential evidence of reciprocal feeling. When Daniel complimented her watercolor attempts, she heard romantic interest. When he brought her soup from his favorite restaurant, because she mentioned feeling weak, she saw courtship. when he texted to check on her between visits. Professional check-ins about symptoms and medication. She read each message a dozen times, analyzing every word for hidden meaning. "You're looking so much better," he said during a visit in mid-November, adjusting his stethoscope after listening to her lungs. "Your color is back. Your energy is improving. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." What she was doing was living for these moments. Daniel had become the sun around which her entire existence orbited. She told herself it was natural. He was her primary caregiver, her connection to the world outside her quiet house, her reminder that she was still alive. But the truth was darker and more desperate than that. Margaret was falling in love. She began to notice everything about him with excruciating detail. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the way he always wore a silver watch on his right wrist, the sound of his laugh, when Captain did something amusing, the coffee smell that clung to his clothes in the morning. She memorized his schedule, his preferences, the stories he told about his weekend hikes. One particularly dangerous afternoon in late November, Margaret found herself researching age-gap relationships on her laptop, convincing herself that 23 years wasn't really that much, that plenty of couples had similar differences, that Daniel's kindness meant something more than professional compassion. She began to fantasize elaborate scenarios. Daniel confessing feelings, Daniel taking her to dinner, Daniel holding her as something other than a patient. In her mind, they would start slowly. Friends first, then maybe more. He would see past her illness and her age to the woman she still was underneath. He would help her heal not just physically, but emotionally. They would build a life together, she and this gentle man who treated her with such care. The fantasies became more detailed, more real in her mind than her actual life. She imagined them hiking together once she was stronger. Daniel patient with her slower pace. She imagined painting while he read beside her, Captain asleep at their feet. She imagined, and this was the most dangerous fantasy of all, being loved again, being chosen again, being worthy of desire again. Her daughter Jennifer noticed the change. "You seem happier, Mom," she said during a brief visit, babies in tow as always. The treatment must be working. "It is," Margaret said, and she believed she was talking about the chemotherapy, not about Daniel's presence in her life. But Patricia, her sister, saw through the facade during a Thanksgiving phone call. Margaret had declined to join the family gathering, claiming fatigue but really wanting to preserve her energy for Daniel's Friday visit. "Are you all right?" Patricia asked. "You sound different, distracted." "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." "Margaret." Her sister's voice carried a note of concern. You're not developing feelings for someone, are you? It's just, you sound like you did back in college when you had that crush on your poetry professor." "Don't be ridiculous," Margaret said, too quickly, too defensively. "I'm just feeling more like myself." After she hung up, Margaret sat in her quiet living room and forced herself to examine what Patricia had detected. Was she developing feelings? No, that was too mild. She had developed feelings. Past tense. Complete. She was in love with Daniel Morrison, her nurse, a man who showed her professional kindness and human decency and nothing more. But admitting this to herself didn't stop the feelings. If anything, naming them made them stronger. That night, she lay in bed imagining what it would be like if Daniel visited not as her nurse, but as her partner. She imagined cooking for him, laughing with him, growing old with him. She imagined a future she had thought was lost forever. Companionship, intimacy, love. The next morning, Daniel arrived for his scheduled visit, and Margaret greeted him with fresh coffee and homemade cookies she had baked, despite her lingering weakness. "This is wonderful," Daniel said, accepting a cookie with genuine pleasure. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's no trouble. I wanted to. She watched him eat, treasuring the domesticity of the moment, filing it away as evidence of something. "Margaret, I have to tell you something," Daniel said after finishing his examination. He sat down with a slightly more serious expression, and Margaret's heart raced with anticipation and terror. "Dr. Patel is really pleased with your progress. Your scans are looking good. She thinks we can probably transition you off home health visits after the new year. You'll just need regular clinic appointments." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. No more home visits. No more Daniel sitting in her living room. No more excuses for him to be in her life. "Oh," she managed, fighting to keep her voice steady. That's good news. It's great news," Daniel said, smiling that warm smile that had undone her so completely. "It means you're healing. You're going to be just fine." But Margaret knew she wouldn't be fine, because somewhere in the last 2 months, Daniel Morrison had become the only thing that made her feel alive. And she was about to lose him, just when she had finally found a reason to keep fighting. She didn't tell him any of this. She simply smiled and thanked him, and waited until he left before she allowed herself to cry. Not from the cancer, not from the treatment, but from the terrible realization that she had made the catastrophic mistake of falling in love with the wrong person at the worst possible time, and the worst part was that he had no idea. Chapter 3. The Terrible Truth. December arrived in Phoenix with cool mornings and perfect afternoons, the kind of weather that made tourists flock to Arizona's winter paradise. For Margaret, the approaching end of home health visits created a quiet desperation she tried hard to hide. She found excuses to text Daniel between appointments, questions about medication timing, concerns about minor symptoms, anything to maintain the connection. He always responded promptly, professionally, kindly. During their visits, Margaret pushed boundaries in small ways. She lingered on casual touches, her hand on his arm when he helped her stand. Gratitude expressed through increasing physical proximity. She dressed more carefully, invested in better scarves, even bought a wig that looked surprisingly natural. When Daniel complimented the wig during a visit, saying she looked lovely, Margaret replayed the compliment in her mind for hours afterward, dissecting every possible meaning. She invited him to stay longer after appointments, offering lunch, asking his opinion on her watercolor paintings, which had improved significantly with practice. Daniel, kind to a fault, often stayed an extra 15 or 20 minutes, genuinely interested in her artistic progress. He never seemed to notice, or perhaps chose not to notice, the way Margaret's eyes tracked his every movement, the careful attention she paid to every word he spoke, the intensity of her focus on him. On a Friday afternoon in mid-December, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't let him slip away without at least trying to establish a connection beyond the patient-nurse relationship. She spent the entire morning preparing, cleaning the house obsessively, baking his favorite chocolate chip cookies, selecting an outfit that she thought made her look younger, healthier, more vital. She even painted her nails, something she hadn't done since before the diagnosis. When Daniel arrived at his usual time, Captain trotting beside him, Margaret had rehearsed what she wanted to say 100 times. "Coffee," she offered, as always. "I'd love some, but I can't today. I have another appointment at noon, and traffic on the 10 is terrible this time of day." He set down his medical bag and began the familiar routine of checking vitals. Margaret felt panic rising. This might be one of her last chances. "Actually, before you start, I wanted to ask you something." Daniel looked up, attentive as always. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She faltered, suddenly aware of how absurd this might sound. But she had come too far to stop. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done these past months. You've been more than a nurse to me. You've been a friend, a real friend, and I wondered if you might want to continue our friendship even after the home visits end. Maybe we could get coffee sometime. Or I could cook you dinner properly, not just snacks during appointments. She watched his face carefully, searching for any sign of reciprocal interest. What she saw instead was something that made her stomach drop. Surprise, followed by a flash of discomfort quickly covered by professional kindness. "Margaret, that's very sweet of you," Daniel said carefully, setting down the blood pressure cuff. "I'm glad I've been able to help you through this difficult time. But I need to maintain professional boundaries. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to socialize with patients outside of work. But I won't be your patient much longer," Margaret pressed, hearing the desperation in her own voice and hating it. "You said yourself I'm almost done with home health, so after that, there wouldn't be any conflict." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Margaret felt the foundation of her carefully constructed fantasy beginning to crack. He sat down in the chair across from her, his expression gentle but unmistakably final. "Margaret, you're a wonderful person. You're talented, strong, and you fought your illness with incredible courage. But I think maybe there's been some misunderstanding about the nature of our relationship." He paused, choosing his words with visible care. "I'm your nurse. I care about you the way I care about all my patients. But that's where it ends. And even if boundaries weren't an issue, I need to be honest with you about something." Margaret's hands were trembling. She clasped them together in her lap, digging her nails into her palms. "What?" "I'm gay, Margaret. I have a partner. His name is Ryan. We've been together for 6 years. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through Margaret's entire being. Gay, partner, Ryan. 6 years. Each word was a small death of every fantasy she had constructed. "I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. What had she thought? That his kindness was attraction? That his professional compassion was romantic interest? That a 35-year-old man would fall in love with a 58-year-old cancer patient who could barely grow hair on her head? The humiliation was so profound it felt physical, like another illness spreading through her body. She had been so completely, catastrophically wrong about everything. Every moment she had treasured, every gesture she had interpreted as potential romance, every imagined future. All of it was delusion, pure delusion built on desperate loneliness and pathetic hope. "I'm sorry if I ever gave you the wrong impression," Daniel continued, his voice kind but firm. "That was never my intention. You're a patient I genuinely care about, and I want to see you healthy, but I can't be what you're hoping I'll be." Margaret stood abruptly, her legs unsteady. "You need to leave. Margaret, please, just leave." She couldn't look at him. She couldn't bear to see pity in those green eyes that she had stared at for hours, imagining they saw her as beautiful, as desirable, as worthy of love. Daniel gathered his things quietly. Captain, sensing the tension, whined softly. At the door, Daniel turned back. "These situations happen more often than you'd think. The patient-caregiver dynamic can create feelings that seem very real but are actually don't," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Don't analyze this. Don't make it a clinical case study. Just go." After he left, Margaret stood in her living room for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just existing in a space of pure humiliation. Then she walked to her bedroom, climbed into bed fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. The reality crashed over her in waves. Daniel had never been interested, not for a moment, not even a little. Every smile had been professional. Every kindness had been part of his job. Every moment she had treasured had meant nothing to him beyond duty and basic human decency. And worse, So much worse. He had a partner, a man he loved, a relationship that was real while she had been living in a fantasy. She had been competing with no one, fighting for something that was never available, chasing someone who could never want her back. The cancer, at least, had been real. The chemotherapy, the nausea, the fear, all real. But this was self-inflicted. She had done this to herself, built this elaborate delusion because she was lonely and scared, and so desperate to feel alive that she had mistaken professional care for romantic possibility. Margaret thought about Daniel going home to Ryan, probably telling him about the awkward situation with a patient. She imagined them laughing together, not cruelly, but with the bemused sympathy people extend to ridiculous situations. This woman actually thought I was interested in her romantically, Daniel might say. Poor thing. The cancer must have really affected her judgment. The humiliation was bottomless. She had been so stupid, so pathetically, embarrassingly stupid. That night, Margaret didn't eat. She didn't paint. She didn't watch television. She simply lay in the dark, replaying every interaction with Daniel through this new, horrible lens of truth. Every moment that had felt special was revealed as ordinary. Every gesture that had seemed intimate was exposed as routine. She had been so wrong about everything. Around midnight, her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "How was your appointment with Daniel today? You feeling okay?" Margaret stared at the message for a long time before typing a response. Fine. Everything's fine. But nothing was fine. Nothing would ever be fine again. Because Margaret Chen had not only survived cancer, she had survived it only to discover that she was exactly what she had feared most. Old, invisible, undesirable, and completely alone. And this time, there would be no kind nurse to help her through the darkness. This time, she would have to face it by herself. The Monday before Christmas, Margaret received a call from the Home Health Agency. Daniel Morrison had requested to be removed from her care team. A different nurse, a middle-aged woman named Sharon, would complete her remaining visits. The administrator delivering this news spoke in carefully neutral tones about scheduling conflicts and caseload adjustments. But Margaret knew the truth. Daniel had asked to be taken off her case because she had made him uncomfortable. She had driven him away with her pathetic, inappropriate feelings. Sharon arrived for the next scheduled visit, efficient, pleasant, and utterly indifferent. She checked Margaret's port, reviewed medications, made notes on her tablet, and left within 20 minutes. No conversation, no lingering, no pretense of connection. This was what professional care actually looked like, Margaret realized. This was the reality Daniel had been living all along, while she had been spinning romantic fantasies. Christmas came and went. Jennifer invited her to celebrate with the family, but Margaret declined, claiming she wasn't feeling well enough. The truth was, she couldn't bear to be around her daughter's perfect life. The attentive husband, the beautiful babies, the photo-worthy holiday moments. She spent December 25th alone in her house, eating microwaved soup and watching mindless television, feeling every one of her 58 years like an anchor tied to her chest. David called from Seattle, his conversation punctuated by the sounds of his wife and children laughing in the background. "You sure you're okay, Mom?" he asked. "You sound down." "Just tired from treatment," she lied. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. She was descending into something that felt like drowning in slow motion. The humiliation from the Daniel situation had triggered a cascade of darker thoughts. If a kind, compassionate man had found her so utterly unappealing that he needed to remove himself from her care, what did that say about her? If even professional obligation couldn't keep him in her life, how could she ever expect anyone to choose her voluntarily? Margaret stopped painting. The watercolors Daniel had given her sat on the dining room table, a monument to her stupidity. She couldn't look at them without remembering the hope she had felt, the future she had imagined, the complete delusion she had constructed. Eventually, she shoved them into the hall closet, unable to throw them away but unwilling to see them. She stopped wearing the wig, stopped applying makeup, stopped bothering with coordinated outfits. She wore the same shapeless gray sweatpants and oversized t-shirt for 3 days straight, moving from bed to couch to bed again. The house fell into disarray, dishes piling in the sink, mail accumulating unopened, dust gathering on surfaces she no longer had the will to clean. Jennifer noticed during a visit in early January. "Mom, what's going on? This place is a mess. You're a mess. Is the cancer back?" "No, the cancer is fine. Everything's fine." "This isn't fine." Jennifer gestured around the cluttered living room, her voice sharp with worry and frustration. "You were doing so well. What happened?" Margaret wanted to tell her, wanted to confess the humiliating truth about Daniel, about her foolish feelings, about the crushing weight of being invisible and undesirable at 58. But the words wouldn't come. How could she explain to her beautiful, successful daughter what it felt like to be discarded by life itself? "I'm just tired," she said instead. "The treatment takes a lot out of me." "Bull," Jennifer said bluntly. "Dr. Patel said you're in remission. Your last scans were clear. Physically, you're doing great. This is something else." After Jennifer left, frustrated and worried but ultimately helpless, Margaret sat in the growing darkness of her living room and let herself think the thoughts she had been avoiding. What was the point of surviving cancer if this was the life waiting on the other side? An empty house, grown children with their own families, an ex-husband happily remarried, no friends, no romantic prospects, no purpose beyond simply continuing to breathe. She thought about Daniel and Ryan, imagining them in their home together. Did they cook dinner side by side? Did they have inside jokes and shared memories? Did Ryan know how lucky he was to be loved by someone like Daniel? Of course he did. Anyone would know. Anyone except Margaret, who had been so desperate for scraps of attention that she had mistaken professional care for affection. The thought that haunted her most was this: Daniel could have loved someone. He had a capacity for love, for commitment, for partnership. He simply couldn't love her. Not because he was incapable of love, but because she, specifically, was unlovable. Too old, too sick, too desperate, too invisible. She began to avoid her phone, letting calls go to voicemail. Jennifer, David, Patricia, Sharon, the home health nurse, checking about a missed appointment, Dr. Patel's office, reminding her about follow-up scans. She ignored them all. She ordered groceries online and had them left on the porch. She stopped showering regularly, stopped eating meals at proper times, stopped following the careful schedule of medications and self-care that had defined her post-treatment life. One particularly dark night in mid-January, Margaret stood in her bathroom staring at the prescription bottles lined up on the counter. Anti-nausea medication, pain management, sleep aids, antidepressants she had been prescribed but never bothered to start taking. She found herself calculating, not seriously, but in that dangerous, detached way, how many pills might be considered too many. What would happen if she simply wanted to sleep and not wake up? The thought terrified her, not because she was actively suicidal, but because she had reached a place where that thought felt like a reasonable consideration rather than an emergency. She backed away from the bathroom counter, her hands shaking, and returned to her bed. But the fact that she had even gone there in her mind told her something was profoundly wrong. Patricia showed up unannounced on a Tuesday morning in late January, letting herself in with the spare key Margaret had given her years ago. She found Margaret in bed at 11 a.m., unwashed and unresponsive. "Margaret Elizabeth Chen," Patricia said, using her full name the way their mother had when they were children in trouble. "What the hell is happening?" Go away. Not a chance. Patricia opened the bedroom curtains, flooding the room with harsh Arizona sunlight. You're not in bed because you're sick. Dr. Patel told Jennifer you're medically clear. So what is this? Depression? A breakdown? Talk to me. I don't want to talk. Patricia sat on the edge of the bed, her expression a mixture of sympathy and steel. Jennifer is worried sick. David is threatening to fly down here. Your doctor is talking about mental health interventions. You can't keep doing this. Whatever happened, whatever you're dealing with, you need help. The dam finally broke. Margaret sat up, her voice raw with weeks of suppressed emotion. I made a fool of myself. I fell in love with my nurse, my gay nurse who has a partner. And I was so pathetic and delusional that I actually thought he might be interested in me. And now he won't even be in the same room with me because I'm such an embarrassment. I survived cancer only to discover I'm exactly what I've always feared. Old, alone, and completely unlovable. So no, Patricia. I don't need help. I need to accept reality. This is my life. Empty and pointless and over except for the paperwork. Patricia listened to the entire confession without interrupting. When Margaret finally fell silent, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks, Patricia reached over and took her hand. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. First, you're not unlovable. You're grieving. Your health, your youth, your marriage, your sense of purpose. And you attached all that grief to the one person who was consistently kind to you. That's human. That's not pathetic. That's survival instinct gone sideways. It feels pathetic. I'm sure it does. But Margaret, you're 58, not dead. You survived cancer. You have decades left. Decades. You can't spend them all in this bed feeling sorry for yourself. Why not? Margaret asked bitterly. What else is there? That, Patricia said firmly, is what we're going to figure out. But first you're going to shower. Then you're going to eat actual food. Then we're going to call Dr. Patel about those antidepressants you never started. And then we're going to talk about what comes next. Margaret wanted to refuse, to send her sister away, to return to the numbing cocoon of her depression. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of shame and hopelessness, a tiny spark of survival instinct flickered. She had fought so hard to live through cancer. Maybe, just maybe, she could fight through this too. Okay, she whispered. Okay. It was the smallest possible step. Chapter 5. But it was a step nonetheless. The antidepressants took 3 weeks to start working. During that time, Patricia stayed in Margaret's guest room, gently bullying her back into the routines of living. Shower, eat breakfast, take medications, go for a short walk, clean one room, accomplish one small task. Some days Margaret managed all of these things. Other days she could barely do 2. But slowly, incrementally, she began to re-engage with existence. Dr. Patel added a therapist to her care team, a woman named Dr. Reeves, who specialized in cancer survivors and geriatric mental health. Margaret resisted at first, convinced that therapy was for people with real problems, not for women who had simply made fools of themselves. But Dr. Reeves had a no-nonsense approach that cut through Margaret's defenses. You're dealing with multiple losses simultaneously, Dr. Reeves explained during their 3rd session in early February. Loss of health, loss of identity, loss of youth, loss of romantic partnership, loss of purpose. You attached all of that grief to Daniel because he represented hope at a time when you felt hopeless. When that hope was revealed as false, it triggered a collapse. But here's what you need to understand. Daniel wasn't your solution. You are. That sounds like a motivational poster, Margaret said dryly, feeling more like herself than she had in weeks. Doesn't make it less true. Tell me about the painting. Jennifer mentioned you were doing watercolors. Margaret thought about the supplies in the closet, hidden away like evidence of a crime. I can't look at them. They remind me of everything. What if they could remind you of something different? What if instead of associating them with Daniel, you associated them with yourself? Your own rediscovery of art? Your own talent? It took another week before Margaret could open that closet. When she finally pulled out the watercolor set, her hands trembled. But this time, she didn't paint for Daniel's approval or to impress anyone. She painted the view from her back window. The desert landscape bathed in February light, the saguaro cacti standing sentinel against pale sky. It wasn't good, but it was hers. Patricia returned to Tucson in mid-February, satisfied that Margaret was stable enough to function independently. "Call me if you slide backward," she instructed. "And I mean it. Call me. Don't wait until you're back in that bed at 11 a.m. "I will," Margaret promised, surprised to find she meant it. In late February, Margaret made a decision that terrified her. She enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center near her house. It met Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and the description promised supportive environment for all skill levels. She almost backed out a dozen times before the first session, convinced everyone would be younger, more talented, more worthy of space in the room. The class was taught by an artist named James Whitmore, a 72-year-old former commercial illustrator with a shock of white hair and an infectious laugh. The other students ranged from a 53-year-old recent divorcee to an 80-year-old retired teacher. They were beginners, intermediates, and a few advanced students who had been with James for years. No one cared about Margaret's bald head, slowly growing back in silver fuzz. No one asked about her medical history. They cared about color mixing and brush techniques, and whether anyone wanted to carpool to the upcoming art supply sale. For the first time in months, Margaret was simply a person in a room full of people, united by nothing more complicated than a shared interest. She was not a patient, not an ex-wife, not a lonely woman with inappropriate feelings. Just Margaret, learning to paint. One evening in early March, after class had ended and most students had left, James approached Margaret while she was cleaning her brushes. "You have a good eye for landscape," he said. "Have you thought about painting en plein air? Outdoors, from observation?" "I haven't painted outside since I was in my 20s. "Well," Margaret admitted, "a group of us go out every Saturday morning. We meet at different locations around Phoenix. Parks, desert preserves, botanical gardens. You'd be welcome to join us." Margaret's first instinct was to decline. But then she remembered Dr. Reeves's words about building a life instead of waiting for one to appear. "I'd like that," she said. "Thank you." The Saturday painting group became the anchor of Margaret's week. She met people, real people with complex lives, retired engineers and former teachers and empty nesters reinventing themselves. They talked about art and politics and grandchildren and the best places to get authentic Mexican food in Phoenix. Margaret found herself laughing, contributing to conversations, feeling her opinions valued and her presence noticed. A man named George, 65 and recently widowed, began saving a spot for Margaret in the group's painting circle. He had kind eyes and a self-deprecating sense of humor, and he seemed genuinely interested in her perspectives on composition and color. Margaret caught herself enjoying his attention, not with the desperate intensity she had felt toward Daniel, but with a quieter, more grounded appreciation. "Would you like to get coffee after painting sometime?" George asked one Saturday in late March, his tone casual but hopeful. "I'd love to hear more about your work. You mentioned you were in marketing before retirement?" Margaret felt a flutter of panic, followed by something unexpected. Curiosity. Not the consuming obsession she had felt before, but simple human interest. George was offering friendship, maybe something more, if they discovered compatibility. He was age-appropriate, available, genuinely interested. And more importantly, Margaret was beginning to feel like someone worth being interested in. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. The coffee date led to a lunch date. The lunch date led to an invitation to an art opening. George didn't sweep Margaret off her feet with romantic intensity. He didn't become the center of her universe. But he became a pleasant presence in her life, someone who texted occasionally, who saved interesting articles to share, who remembered she didn't like cilantro and that she was allergic to cats. In April, Jennifer visited and noticed the dramatic transformation. The house was clean and organized. Margaret was dressed in actual clothes with coordinated colors. There were fresh flowers on the dining room table, and evidence of life being actively lived rather than passively endured. "Mom, you look amazing," Jennifer said, genuine surprise in her voice. "What happened?" Margaret thought about how to answer. She couldn't explain the entire journey from humiliation to depression to slow resurrection. But she could offer a simplified truth. "I guess I decided to start living again. Really living. Not just surviving." "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. You look happier than I've seen you in years." That evening, alone in her house after Jennifer left, Margaret sat at her dining room table with her watercolor supplies spread before her. She was working on a series of desert landscape paintings for a group show James was organizing at the community center. Her hands were steady. Her focus was clear. The cancer was in remission, hopefully forever, possibly not. But either way, today she was healthy. She thought about Daniel Morrison occasionally, but without the sharp pain that had once accompanied his memory. She hoped he was well. She hoped his relationship with Ryan was happy. She hoped he had found fulfillment in his work and his life. She could think these things now without bitterness, without longing, without the terrible weight of unfulfilled desire. What she had mistaken for love had been a lifeline, desperately grabbed at a moment of profound vulnerability. Daniel's kindness had pulled her through darkness, but she had confused the guide for the destination. He had never been meant to be her salvation. That work, she had finally learned, was hers alone to accomplish. Margaret picked up her finest brush and added delicate details to the saguaro in her painting. The subtle texture of the skin, the play of shadow and light, the way the desert sun caught the edges of the spines. It wasn't perfect. Some proportions were off, some colors not quite right, but it was undeniably, authentically hers. Outside, the Phoenix evening was settling into comfortable warmth. Her phone buzzed with a text from George. "Thinking about Saturday's painting spot. Desert Botanical Garden? They have special spring blooms right now." "Sounds perfect," Margaret typed back. And it did. Not perfect in the way fairy tales promised, with romantic music and dramatic declarations. Perfect in the quieter, more sustainable way of a life built one ordinary day at a time. Perfect in the way of second chances, and hard-won wisdom in the way of a woman who had survived both cancer and heartbreak, and had somehow, improbably, found herself on the other side still capable of beauty, connection, and hope. Margaret Chen was 58 years old. Her hair was growing back silver. Her body bore the scars of illness and treatment. She was divorced, aging, and far from the person she had once imagined she would be. But she was painting. She was connecting. She was living. And for now, that was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.